I feel like Superman, they gon' remember me. I think I know I can. Who says it's hard to reach? Who's gonna stop me on the road to success? I don't know. They try to break me down, but I'm still on my feet. This city's full of life, so why is it hard to breathe? Oh, why did God create this world so unfair? I don't know.
So what I want to do firstly, I would like to ask you a question, and that is, can you tell us about Hansel and Gretel?
I can.
And then I'm going to pick you some questions from the ones that we've had. There's going to be no kind of Q&A, but you've already queued, and I'm going to re-queue.
And I will
A. So this is your beautiful new book, Hansel and Gretel. Tell us about it.
So this is a beautiful new book called Hansel and Gretel. And it began in about 2006 or 2007 when an amazing and wonderful artist named Lorenzo Mattotti did a sequence of India ink drawings for a Hansel and Gretel exhibition at the Opera House in New York. And I was shown the drawings by Françoise Mouly, who is the editor of two books, and she said, have you ever had any interest in retelling the story of Hansel and Gretel? And I thought, well, actually, mostly what I like doing with fairy tales is screwing them up. And I've done that before many times. I thought, but actually Hansel and Gretel is a story that I've always wanted to tell straight. And I've always wanted to tell it straight because, partly because when I first heard the story, it troubled me so much. It was on the radio. And I was maybe 4 years old. And I just thought, hang on. I'm food. And parents can just abandon children. People would want to eat. Why did nobody tell me this? It was like terrifying. And then, when I was in my 20s, I was reading, I think it was the Bettelheim Uses of Enchantment. And if it wasn't, it was one of the sub-Bettelheim books on fairy tales. And it was a whole, many pages on how Hansel and Gretel was all about sex. And I thought, hang on, you have a story which begins with a famine, which has two parents out of food, abandoning their children in the forest because they don't have enough for 4 people to eat. And the children laying a trail of breadcrumbs, using the last of their food to try and get home, and it gets eaten. And then you have a gingerbread house, you have this place that attracts them. They gorge on it, and now they're being fattened up for protein by this. This is a story about hunger. Sex is great. I'm not saying things aren't about sex, but I'm saying if you are too hungry to think of anything else, hunger is going to trump sex, and this is a hunger story, and I want to tell that. So basically that was what I did. Hansel and Gretel, I just got to try.
Comes out quite soon. Comes out this week.
In about a week.
Yeah.
And these amazing, weird, beautiful drawings that look almost abstract. So yes, that's
but I mean, it must be. I mean, it must be totally exhausting being you because in my research, I can call it research for this interview. I was looking online and just this morning or yesterday there was something in the news about how you've managed to either annoy, scandalise, or delight somebody by having a woman kiss Sleeping Beauty to wake her up, perhaps, I think, rather than a man. And I was just like, God, that would take up a year of someone's life explaining that. But you, on the other hand, that's just a future thing, is it, the Sleeping Beauty?
Actually, that's coming out in the UK this week, and then coming out in America sometime next year. So I wrote a story a couple of years ago called The Sleeper and the Spindle, in which was what I was talking about earlier on, where I mess around with fairy tales. I was just very interested in seeing what happened if you collided the stories of Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, and what would happen if you sent a queen out to rescue a sleeping princess. And it's a very odd story, and again, incredibly beautifully illustrated by Chris Riddell. And now it does appear to be alternately scandalizing and delighting people in England, which is actually rather awkward for me, because the people who are acclaiming me,
Gay people love it.
gay people love it, and I feel like apologizing to everybody and saying, it's just the kiss that she wakes her up with. They don't shag afterwards. First of all, he's the first Doctor ever to get an Academy Award.
Right.
So, Tom Baker didn't have an Academy Award.
I remember him playing, do you remember this? He played in a very early Prime Suspect. He played kind of a transvestite male prostitute. I mean, he blew my mind ever since then.
I first worked with him when he played the Angel Islington in Neverwhere on telly. And he was very... I actually hadn't realized quite how rough it was for him until I ran into him a couple of months ago in New York at the screening, the first episode. He came over to me and said, Neil, and I said, Peter, he said, good to see you. I said, good to see you. And I said, look, I'm really sorry that you were so cold. He was wearing nothing but a light reflective robe in London, in the coldest day of the year, in a power station that you could not heat, but that looked amazing, which was where we were filming all the Islington stuff. And I'd known that I'd made him really cold, and I apologized, and he said, it wasn't just that. He said, I also back then had a horrible physical reaction to contact lenses, and Islington had these big black contact lenses, and every time he'd put them in, I'd start vomiting. So I'd come in for work in the morning, and the first thing I'd do was I'd be throwing up, and then shivering, and then I'd go up. And I said, sorry, and he said, it's what they pay me for. I think it's great. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens in the next season. He's doing that thing that's where you spend the first 3 or 4 episodes with a new Doctor going, this is not my Doctor. And then somewhere around the middle, 3/4 of the way through, you suddenly realize that he became your Doctor. He became the real Doctor, not just an actor, a few episodes ago. You're not quite sure when the transition happened.
Who was your Doctor? There's a reason for this. Was your Doctor Pertwee?
My Doctor was Troughton.
Troughton, so you're like a couple of years older than me, basically. Yeah. Right. So I wonder, it's very interesting to me to think, do you think that going back and was Troughton colour?
No, black and white.
Okay, so Pertwee was at least colour. I'm wondering what people today would think of a Pertwee episode of Doctor Who.
I think it depends on the episode. There was some incredibly well written.
That's quite a good one.
Green Death with giant maggots, which were actually condoms.
Yes.
That's how you make giant maggots. Green condoms. You would draw them. You need a luminous green.
We'll have a couple more questions.
Yes.
The question is, what made you want to start writing for children as well as adults, and what are the pluses and minuses of each audience? But I think that comes down to what I would kind of like to ask about the same thing, which is, do you make any differentiation really between children and adults when you're writing?
To some extent. I will write books which are relatively uncompromisingly not intended for children, except for really smart ones who steal them and read them under the covers.
Right.
American Gods is not intended for kids. I did specific things to signal that it was not intended for kids, including the fact that word 15 is fuck, including the fact that the first chapter is kind of dull. It all takes place in prison, and a lot of it's happening in somebody's head, including the very peculiar and extreme sex scene at the end. That's all sort of, just giant signals that this is not a children's book. On the other hand, there are no children's books that I'm going to write that I do not expect adults to read. and probably enjoy, because adults, by their nature, are going to have to read books to kids. They're going to have to experience children's books. And the terrible thing is that if kids really like them, you may have to read them a lot.
Yes.
So, but do I make a distinction? No. I'm always vaguely puzzled that other writers don't. But then I'm always puzzled that other writers don't do all of the things.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I'm always faintly envious of novelists, because I'll meet them, and it's like meeting this sort of order of higher beings, because they are dedicated to the novel, and they are novelists. And I could never be a novelist, because then I'd have to stop being a Rights TV sometimesist, or a bloggist, or whatever the things are. You know, I like having the freedom to do whatever I want, and that includes children's books, because I love children's books, and they give people power. That includes non-fiction, that includes essays, that includes writing introductions to things that I want people to read, because I think it'll be a good thing for them to read.
Well, part of the world of fantasy seems to be about, despite sometimes the heaviness and mind-bendiness of the ideas, appealing to something childlike in adults, which wants to visualize a kind of, I don't know, a fantasy world. Like Lord of the Rings is, I mean, it's really hard to think of that as a children's book, but it is.
Well, The Hobbit was. I don't think Tolkien intended Lord of the Rings to be a children's book.
But I'm making a more general point. It's like, your sentences are not difficult to comprehend sentences in a novel. Your dialogue is not obtuse dialogue. I mean, it's there to be understood, isn't it?
I like clarity. I remember I was once, 2007, I was at a literary festival in Parachi in Brazil. And there were a very odd bunch of people. There was me and Tom Stoppard and David Sedaris and another couple of people. And Tom Stoppard was being interviewed, and he was asked a very long, complicated question about what he looked for in an actor. Was he looking for the ability to interpret subtext? Was he looking for what they could bring to the part? Was he looking for this? Was he looking for that? There was a long pause, then he said, I'm looking for clarity of utterance. And I thought, oh yeah, that, clarity of utterance. That, for me, is what, that's what I've always tried to go for. Whatever I'm writing and whoever it's for, I would like clarity of utterance, which does not mean that I'm not absolutely willing to send you off to the dictionary. If the correct word is one that you do not happen to know, because I want to use the correct word, because that's clarity of utterance. But it also means I'm unlikely to write in a way that is intentionally obfuscatory. I want to be clear for adults or for kids.
I mean, it's easy to imagine a book like American Gods written in an incredibly different way by a different writer, and that comes down to the same as you and John Grisham and Stephen King looking at the same shed. If you give 3 different writers the same book to write, they'll all come up with a different book, even if you've given them the complete subject matter.
Absolutely. But having said that, I also knew when I was writing American Gods that there was a sort of a particular style, which I tend to think of as American third-person invisible. The thing that Elmore Leonard wrote, and the thing that Stephen King does when he's really on his game, where you feel like there's nothing between you and the text.
Yeah.
And the English love standing between the person and the text. They love commenting. We love authorial voices that are very voicey. And you know who is telling you this story, and that's something I love doing. And sometimes I would actually wind up imagining who my writer was.
Right.
For Stardust, when I wrote Stardust, I decided I wanted it to have been written pre-Tolkien. It needed to have been written when fantasy was not a genre. The books just went on the shelves next to everything else. The time of Sylvia Townsend Warner,
right.
The time of Lord Dunsany, these books that would just go on the shelves. And I thought, needs to be probably written by a woman, probably sometime in the mid-20s. And for me, that was my author. And
makes perfect sense.
yes.
Here's a good question. Will you blurt my next novel? Oh no, sorry, I was going to ask you that later. I was going to ask that one later. One last question, then we're going to go. When we finish, Neil and I will exit swiftly down the middle of the room before you leave the room. I want to thank, before this last question, I want to thank you for these excellent questions that we have used. They're fantastic, and thanks for getting them in advance. And most particularly, I would like to thank Michael Arthur, who has been drawing. And thank you to Neil, who's come quite a way to be with us today and has quite a way to go back today. And so we're going to give a nice round of applause for giving so generously of his time. And my last question is this. We've a number of us here have taught creative writing at Fairleigh Dickinson University. You are one of the foremost fantasy writers in the world today, which is such an amazing fact that you're here today. A lot of the work that I was presented with when I was teaching here was in the fantasy genre because the kids are into it and they want to write it. What would be some simple advice from you to any budding creative writing person who's into fantasy?
Right. So you want to write, and you want to write fantasy. So first thing I would tell you is to read what you like to read. Stop reading fantasy. Or keep reading fantasy, but read everything else too. Read history, read non-fiction, read biography, go and explore those parts of the bookshop that you have up until now never gone into. One reason why Terry Pratchett and I found it so very easy to collaborate was not because we'd read all the same fantasy stuff, although we had, but because we'd read all the same non-fiction stuff. We both had an obsession with Brewer's Phrase and Fable, strange Victorian books of fact and factoid. When we run into each other, still we compare notes on peculiar books, which are the places you go for inspiration. You don't go to inspiration for somebody else's novel. Go to inspiration for somewhere that nobody else is looking.
It's what's going to make your fantasy world into an original fantasy world as opposed to an unoriginal fantasy.
Exactly. And also, the bottom line for me, if anybody's writing fantasy, is what makes fantasy strong, what makes fantasy powerful. And what makes it powerful is it's about something. And the way that fantasy is about something is because you are concretizing metaphors. You are taking something that is metaphorical and you are making it concrete and real. Human beings are very peculiar. We have strange brains. And our brains actually are programmed to respond to metaphors. They did a test recently where they gave people a warm mug of coffee or tea or hot liquid to hold while they met people. And they discovered that people who were holding a hot liquid rated the people they were meeting as warmer people. We process metaphor very literally. And one of the things that you can do with metaphor is take an idea, you know, her world fell to pieces, and actually make it real, and see how you can make it real. And once, I got my writing students once I was telling you, write, I told them I wanted a short story that was a first date, in which they made the stressful thing about the first date real. If somebody was going to go into their shell, they could go into their shell. If they were going to pieces, they could go to pieces. And suddenly these people were writing, actually, what fascinated me was the stories were more honest and more personal than the honest, personal stuff they were meant to have been writing.
Right.
Because now they were actually able to step outside it just a little. And I think that, you know, the joy of fantasy for me, the joy of the fantastic, is just being able to see the world from a slightly different angle. It's like a mirror. And you're seeing something that you are familiar with already, but you're seeing it in a way that you've never seen it before. And that gives the writing power. And so that is what I would advise anybody out there who wants to write fantasy, and frankly, anybody who wants to write anything, to do is take the world, turn it a little bit, and then tell it honestly.
Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Gaiman.
Lie down in your arms.